Hello, welcome to another podcast episode of Anthony's Animation Talk. I'm pleased to have with me today my good friend Keith Scott, author of Cartoon Voices. Say hi, Keith.
Hello there, Anthony. Great to talk to you again.
Yes, yeah, I love these chats that we have, and I love the fact, once again, you're in the same time zone as me. Always a wonderful thing. But I tell you, I'm so happy to talk to you about these books here. Well, it's actually books plural.
Right.
Cartoon Voices, Volume 1 and 2, and for doing these videos that I do, I mean, Volume 2 especially has been very handy.
Of course, yeah, that's right. With the list, the filmography of credits. Yep.
Exactly, and because as you may know, I have had to redo a lot of the older commentaries. I won't get into the nitty gritty there, but it was nice to when, even though I have to revisit them, I could actually look at this and go, okay, I'm redoing Clean Pastures, and it's like okay, we know it's the Ben Carter's Plantation Choir, and it's all right here for people to see.
Yes.
It's fantastic. So,
well, the only thing that's an author's nightmare is that new information is already creeping in tiny little dribs and drabs. So further down the track, like with Jerry Beck's famous Warner Brothers book, there will be a volume 2 revised and corrected. So I don't want to stop people from buying the first one because it's pretty comprehensive. It's one of those things that calls for ongoing research.
Definitely. You're always going to find something new, and that's something we'll certainly get into here in our little chat. I mean,
sure.
First up, I mean, how does it feel to finally, after all these years, have this in people's hands?
Well, it's such a relief because it really did take a solid 30 years of putting together, and that was started in the pre-internet era before YouTube made things more convenient. It really entailed so many different sources and ways of researching it because there was no template for this. There's no great source of documentation about all these voice people who were never credited. Thank goodness I was interested in American old-time radio from 1973 because that's when I began collecting it and noticing that so many voices that appeared on some of the, especially comedy shows, ended up in cartoons. And that really was the thing that triggered my interest in contacting 2 other guys who'd written a piece on vintage voices for Funny World, Mike Barrier's famous old magazine. And I got to know Hames Ware very well. He sadly passed, but he was my research associate. And we spent a lot of time listening to just cartoon tracks. And I'm talking back in the analog cassette days, and we just moved with the times with all the updated technology up until the Blu-ray era, of course. But a lot of that was just really hard yakka. It was just listening constantly and honing our ears and learning about some of these people based on radio appearances. And then finally, in the early 2000s, I got to some of the studio archives in Los Angeles, such as the famous Jack Warner collection at USC. And that was where it was really the final stage, and you started seeing professional documentation that had been kept. The guy who ran that, Leith Stevens, has long been with Warner Brothers in an archival position, and he and I couldn't find anything until one visit in 2002 where he suddenly said, you know what? I have this feeling that they used to bill all of the recording sessions on the cartoons to the music department. So he said, when you're in there, get them to pull out the boxes saying music department payroll records. And sure enough, in each box from 1942 to 49, there was 52 folders, one for each week. And each folder had the recordings done that week at Warner Brothers for feature films or for short films and cartoons. And suddenly there it is in front of me. Hobby Horse laughs, production number, Kent Rogers, Mel Blanc, Robert Bruce, and this is like my holy grail moment where my head's exploding, and then to make it even better, Ned Comstock, the curator of the whole cinema TV library over there, and you'll see his name in many books, came in with a whole bunch of MGM music department material for me and said, we found this. So that's where we suddenly thought this is going to be a credible thing because so much of this information is now confirmed. And the happy part of it was, a lot of the information confirmed guesses that we had made, but had question marks against. So we were able to remove about 50 question marks, because if you think about, say, one character finally being confirmed, say Kent Rogers, the actor who did the impersonations, once that was confirmed, that took care of, say, 40 cartoons. Because
Right.
we knew it was the same voice, but we just didn't know if it was exactly one man that we were guessing. So this shows you what a convoluted, long way of researching an animation book this had to be. And I'm the first to admit that it's an unusual topic to do a book about, simply because having been a professional cartoon voice actor all my life, 40 years. I know all the problems, and I know how it works. I know that the voice recording is percentage-wise only a very small part of a whole cartoon's production. Really, the hard labor, of course, as you know, is the months and months of animation and layout and storyboarding and all of those labor-intensive, especially the ink and painting in the old days and the old technology. You look back on the body of work now, and you suddenly realize that the one thing people remember about these things is if it's got a great character voice, that's what they remember. And of course, now with the advent of YouTube, where people can flip on a cartoon immediately, one of the first questions with younger folk who didn't grow up with it as I did on random showings on television is, wow, who did that weird voice, So again, that was one of the motivating factors, that we kind of knew there'd be a lot of questions once the internet came along. So
Oh,
there's my
yeah.
long answer about
Of
why it
course.
took so long.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, would it be fair to say that the more trickier ones to pinpoint would be the impressionists, the
Yes.
ones doing all the different voices versus someone who used their own natural voice?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, especially fortunately for myself and Haynes, where we were both the same boomer age, where we had also been old movie buffs, growing up in the old black and white TV era, where you only had 3 channels, and each day of the week, every day of the year, there was the old black and white movies. So we instantly knew, unlike succeeding generations, we knew W.C. Fields because we'd seen a W.C. Fields movie that night on TV. And when you see him caricatured in a cartoon, that was already there, because they've whitewashed a lot of the old black and white movies out of existence unless you buy DVDs. You hardly ever see
Exactly.
them now. And in this country, they got rid of TCM, which is a big pity. But yeah, that really does explain a lot of it.
I would imagine that the challenge for you had all this data, you had all this information, especially after
Right.
visiting the
Yes.
studios and
Yeah.
the archives and whatnot. How much of a challenge was it just to put everything together? Because I would imagine that would be
Yes.
an extraordinary feat.
Well, all along, while we were researching the actual voice topic, of course, I was fascinated by the history of it, being in that industry. I'm one of those Sherlock Holmes types who loves the history of my own industry. So I'd bought, the standard texts like Leonard Maltin, Mike Barrier, Hollywood cartoons, and was pretty well versed in the history, and Mike helped a lot by allowing me to see transcripts of many of his pioneer interviews with people who are long gone simply because of old age. So I kind of had the history in mind, and had all the points there, and had all the information and data that you talked about in separate old-fashioned folders that I've still got in the old filing cabinets. And so all of the stuff was there ready to be put into book form. Then it was really my decision just to how much to include. I could have, see, when I did my first book, The Moose That Roared, about Rocky and Bullwinkle, apart from the fact that I was very happy that it was received well, but there was certain percentage of criticism saying too much information, this is too historical. We just wanted a funny book about the moose and the squirrel. So there was that audience to consider. And so I could have made even the historical volume 1, more filled with information, but then I'd be repeating stuff that's already in the standard texts, like the Disney books and Molten Barrier. And I didn't really want to repeat even some well-known anecdotes, because they'd been in about 3 or 4 books, and most people like you know them by now.
Oh, yes.
So I didn't want to gild that lily, but I did find enough funny little tangents in so many of the transcripts that I thought, boy, there's really a book here already, with just relating it to the history of the voice recording aspect of it. And the final decision I made was just, why not turn it into also a slight history of the actual process of recording cartoons, so that there was a little hint of the recording sessions in each chapter as well, to show how it began in the Vitaphone era, and then moved into the tape era, and then, of course, beyond my time frame to today's digital era. And so there's a little hints of that as well. The idea of these actors who are very busy in radio being called by their agents to go and do a cartoon, and what it was like recording them. I just tried to make it at least a bit interesting and not a totally dry history. There had to be a percentage, and unfortunately I wanted Warner Brothers to be the first chapter, but unfortunately I knew that the driest part was going to be the really early stage about talking about Vitaphone and sound coming to movies and all of that, because that wasn't the prime interest which the cover seems to indicate,
Yeah. No. Oh, yes.
And yet, of course, it had to be, because there had to be a beginning of this whole thing. And of course, and the final thing is, I wanted to get the balance right by making Mel Blanc the star of the book, simply because he was, and he really did invent the art form to a degree.
Oh, definitely. And I can say, as someone who does have a little trouble reading some books, that's just me. That's
Sure, yeah.
For whatever reason, I haven't had a look into that. But in reading this, I got to say, even the so-called, as you say, the dry stuff,
right, sure.
was very well written. I was fascinated by the whole thing. But as you say, yeah, you have to start somewhere, and you got to start
exactly
right at the beginning. I mean, you even made Buddy interesting, which So hey, I'd say well done if you can have that, do that. But as you rightly say, Mel Blanc was truly the star, and I do like the fact that you cleared up some of the things that he was saying in his later years. I mean,
that was always just more for the public, the way showbiz works. You get a few anecdotes and string them together. I mean, there are a couple of actors who were not like that. Dawes Butler always liked to be very accurate and authentic in his with specific questions he was asked. But Mel Blanc and June Foray and Chuck Jones loved the standard talk show anecdotes, and within some of them there was a few howlers that we had to clear up. I mean, I also humanized Mel Blanc to the point where I mentioned that he got a bit territorial about his position at one point, and I hope that doesn't upset Noel or people like that. But to me, it just made him a more rounded individual instead of this icon that his own book painted, where he came across as almost just a detached voice and not a human being.
Well, humans, we're all going to have our bad days, and all that. And I don't think anything with it was, I guess, malicious. I read it and I thought, that this is fair. At some point,
I tried to keep it fair. Yeah,
exactly, because at some point, as you, I guess, get older and you see all these other new players, of course, a lot of us would feel threatened in some way, I would imagine. But I thought it was definitely fair, and I'm glad. I think you also mentioned the whole so-called Happy Rabbit story that seems to be a lot of people.
That was the one that they all hated, Tex Avery and Chuck Jones and everyone. Happy Rabbit? Yeah.
It's like, where did that come from? Yeah. Exactly. And
I do remember, I think Chuck Jones told me once, or it might be in one of the books too, that at one point Tex Avery momentarily thought of maybe calling him Jack Rabbit because of the Texas Jackrabbits, but that wasn't to be. No. I think the fact that the Bugs Hardaway thing happened was a great coincidence.
Oh, exactly. Bugs is Bunny. Yeah, exactly. It's such a great name. Also
known because of Bugsy Siegel, that it was also an expression that was a nickname that for people who had a short fuse or some personality quirk. So Bugs was great in two senses.
Oh, exactly right. Now, and of course, I would imagine that at some point you just decided, right, I'm going to do the history of the different studios and include information there, but also include a volume 2. I mean, at what point did you just make that decision where it's like, you know what, I think doing it in 2 volumes is probably the best way to go?
Oh, that decision was made for me. The idea of the filmographies was going to be always there from the very beginning of our research, because we wanted to end the book that we envisioned in our heads back in the 90s. We wanted to end it with a reference guide with accurate voice credits for the first time, instead of, and unfortunately, because the book took so long, in the meantime, along came IMDb and Wiki, and some of them have been tainted with guesswork, and inaccurate. Well, even from the very first appearance of voice chasers back in the year 2000, I think it was, or earlier, where they said Paul Frees was the voice of the Fox and the Crow at Columbia. Well, they started doing that 4 years before Paul Frees came to Los Angeles. So things like that we found annoying. But no, just to answer your question, once I submitted the book to Ben at Bear Manor Media, then it became a query from the people who are going to publish the book in the way books are published these days, very overnight. Once it's typeset, it can be mass produced. It was decided, they said it's going to be a lot easier to distribute this if we cut this into 2 volumes, because it was going to be a huge, thick book, like a mini telephone book. And so I immediately, after being a little upset, I just emailed him and said, how about we put the filmography as volume 2? And I also put that by Jerry Beck. And he said, great idea, because then it'll be a real reason for having a volume 2. So that relieved me. But then I find out when I spoke to Mark Arnold and Camden, that Camden, I think, works in the library system in America.
He does in Alabama, yeah.
Yeah, and he that's in Alabama. He said, no. He said there's a reason the distributors said that, because of the spine of the book can be affected if it's too thick, especially for the hardcover ones. Especially for the paperback ones, because it's going to be so thick that that's right, yeah, and eventually the pages will start coming loose. So there was that technical reason. So it all makes sense now, and yet it looks like a plan on my part because of the fact that it was a cutoff and put the reference section as volume 2.
Oh, exactly, and it's helped me, I will say. I mean,
right.
As much as I love Volume 1, and I truly do, Volume 2 it's very especially handy for me, like I said, for when I'm just having a look at these voices, so I can go, okay, yep.
Yeah, it's like a checklist, and that one is going to be added to, as I mentioned to you recently. I don't know why I completely forgot the Loopy-de-Loop series, probably because they resemble TV cartoons so much, and my cutoff point was the beginning of the TV era. I completely forgot that they were released theatrically by Columbia. So my revision of the Columbia part of the filmography will reflect Loopy-de-Loop plus the 2 Hanna-Barbera features of the 60s. Because, the title of the book really says 1930 to 70, so my cutoff point's 70. The Hey There, It's Yogi Bear was 64, and Man Called Flintstone 66, and both released theatrically.
Yeah.
They have now been done, and they're entered into the master of the one to be submitted as revised edition.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, speaking of the revised edition, I mean, how much, I suppose, are you waiting on before you can say, right, I can justify a whole new release versus just like one little change?
I would say at least 1 to 2 years, only for the reason that people will get a bit perturbed if they've just spent the money on the book and suddenly they've got to buy a brand new one. But the way search engines are now able to go through trade papers like Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, there's so much tiny bits of information that come up from them from time to time that I'm almost expecting some of the questions that I had right at the end of the book might even be solved by the time 2 years comes by, or however long I decide. And then there'll be a nice reason for the book, at least for volume 2 to be revised. There's been a couple of slight rewrites of things in volume 1 that are more just clarifications, a little tiny thing, say, for instance, about Bill Thompson, the voice of Droopy, that he was still working. I actually thought he had left showbiz when he went into the business world with Union Oil. But no, it turns out that I've seen a letter from him where he was still able to take time off to do voiceover work. Just clarifying things like that,
Sure.
Just more, I really don't think the audience would care less, but it's just me being very retentive about it all.
Exactly, and that was actually an interesting moment because I knew Bill Thompson. I know in the '60s he wasn't doing as much. I know he did Scrooge. You knew he did Scrooge McDuck, and he did in Aristocats. That old
Touche Turtle was really the last biggie he did for Hanna-Barbera, if you can call that show a biggie.
Well, yeah. I grew up with that actually. I
like it. I do like it. Yeah,
it'd be nice if they can release that on disc.
Yes,
I'm not sure if they have or not. But no, stuff like that. I was like, oh, okay. He went into business, and that sort of stuff fascinated me.
Well, I think he started in business world in 57, but he was still working up until like 1970, the year before he died, in Aristocats and things. But I mean, I'm sure it was on a reduced scale. When he was a freelance actor, that was when radio was king, and he was doing Fibber McGee and Molly for 20 years, where he invented that Wallace Wimple voice that was modified into droopy.
Hello, folks.
That's one thing. Hello, folks. Yeah, I mean, I can't. You're definitely way better than me.
Well,
You got these.
it's got to be a very fizzy sound because he had that quality in his voice.
Yeah, you got to change your face a little to do
Yes,
that.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
With your mouth, yeah.
I'm definitely nowhere near that. Lots of practice for me if I want to get into that for
Oh,
sure.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. So many people like you just automatically fall into doing the voices anyway because you've lived with these cartoons for so long.
Oh yeah. Oh, exactly, and including Quick Draw McGraw, the whole El Capone, that kind of like it just
Yes.
sticks with you, and
It's a great character too, and again one that we wish had an official release.
oh yes, that one I believe it's due to the music rights. That's
I
a bit
think
of
so.
an
Yeah,
issue, which is a bit of a shame. I mean, and even with my wife, I do the whole Fred Flintstone. Oh boy, like when she tells me something, I'm just go, oh boy. Yeah, and she actually knows where it's from.
Where
I have
that's
to.
from, yeah.
Other people will be like, "What are you on about?" I mean, but were there any studios? Because you covered a fair few studios in here, and I know you explained why you didn't do certain studios. But
Right.
were there any studios that you would have loved to have covered? But
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the famous studios, because that went up into the cutoff point, like around 67, 68, to include famous in the filmography. But there were still a lot of extra voices that would have had question marks in literally every entry towards the end, where I knew some, but I didn't know them all. And that was one that I wanted to do more research on. But then COVID hit. So the last 2.5 years, I wasn't allowed to travel. So that's when I made the decision, full speed ahead, let's do what I've got. Because so many people were saying to me, you've got enough. You can always do a follow-up book years down. And it turns out, that it's sold well enough because it has got enough in it. But there are always going to be the New York purists. And I mean, I'm one of them. I love the New York cartoons, but I couldn't get to Van Buren, of course. And again, because that studio ended in 35, records weren't even kept back then of the voices, and so much of it was still staff members jumping in and doing whatever limited dialogue there was, or an occasional. But I thought, maybe if I was able to get to that famous research library in New York City, the Billy Rose Theatre Collection, it's the premier showbiz library, and I thought the librarians there are so good they could possibly find some articles about Van Buren back in the day from newspapers that had some just human interest mention of who some of the singing groups and things were. But so that wasn't to happen at this time, and I still haven't got a copy of Hal Erickson's book about the Van Buren studio. I hear it's very good, and I did think his double volume on the TV cartoons was excellent.
Oh yeah, I haven't got that Van Buren book either, but that's definitely on the to purchase list. But
I think Camden said it was very good. So
yeah. It's just I'm just going to blame it on inflation, like everyone else seems to do in terms of purchasing power.
Blame our former Prime Minister Scott Morrison for making Amazon where you then had to pay GST and it changed the whole thing.
Yes, I think that some people call it the Harvey Norman tax or something. I don't know,
yes, that's right.
It's ridiculous, but it is what it is. I will source it at some point.
We live with all of these things that are hitting us, but it used to be so much easier in the early days when the Looney Tunes Golden collections were being released, because even if you could order 3 or 4 items in one, and they didn't charge you individual postage for each item like they do now. Everything's a rip-off these days.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky, but it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah.
But I was actually going to ask you the question. At what point did you say you had enough for the book to be written? But you pretty much covered that.
Well, yeah, it really reached that point once COVID hit, and I knew that was the end of my annual research trips to LA for a foreseeable future.
Yeah, but do you plan on going back anytime soon to the US?
Yes, I'm thinking of going in July, more just to catch up with things. And also there was a possibility, I think Mark Evanier said there's a possibility I can plug this book at the Comic Con if I want to. And if I do, I'm only going to be there like one day because I'm not good with huge crowds like that. And apparently, it's horrendous unless you're making a holiday where it's part of the whole holiday.
Oh yeah, I mean, I do frequent the conventions
Right.
here in Australia, but yeah, they're nowhere near as big as what they have at Comic
Yeah.
Con, and
Well, it
it's
just grew like a mushroom over there. Yeah.
yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted. If you don't like your crowds, I mean, I guess if you're just there to hop on stage, plug the book, and then
Yeah.
go, I guess it'd be okay. But yeah, if you're trying to see all these different panels and booths and all
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
then
Exactly.
strap in, you'll be in for a ride. I can.
Yeah, well, actually, really, it wasn't even to plug the book so much. I mean, that would be mentioned. It was more just to get me on a voice panel because he's said over the years, if you're ever in town when Comic Con's on, and also because Stu wants me back on Stu's show to talk about the book, and that's one that I've done, I think, 4 appearances on.
Yeah, it's a great show.
It is, yeah.
I always have trouble saying certain names. Stoshak, isn't it?
Shostak, yeah.
Shostak, yeah. See,
Well,
it's just
it's confusing because his video company was Shokus Video.
yeah.
Shokus. So, and that was in the days of VHS when he used to be able to release old public domain TV variety shows and comedy shows and things in pretty good quality. He had a home film converter.
Yeah. He's definitely.
No, he's technically accomplished. That's for sure. Much more than me.
But and his show's great too, and it's not just for the Jerry Beck appearances. I know a lot of the the cartoon fans seem to be most eager for that. But no, all these episodes are fantastic. But
and he's such a buff, and he cares about vintage cartoons as much as he does about vintage television. So he's a great question asker and audience. You can go nuts on that show, and because it goes for like 4 hours, you know.
Yeah, oh yeah. So, which look, I don't plan to have us on for 4 hours.
No.
But in terms of the topic at hand, because you said it's a very, very niche topic, and it indeed is. I mean, I guess why do you think this type of book hadn't been attempted before? I know some magazines you mentioned, sort of had it in the 70s, but in terms of a fully fledged book. Why do you think no one's actually even attempted it, at least for like one studio, for example?
Right, yeah. Well, I think it's mainly because of the perceived lack of information. And that's something that I had to work through all those years and find whatever was there. I mean, there was stuff I found at the Columbia archives for UPA cartoons, but again, fragmented. You know, not every title, just a few, you know, with recording dates and uncredited actors, which again helped me because, again, they were people that were in more than one cartoon. Little things like that would have prevented it, and also I think the fact that the first 6 or so years of the 1930s were obviously just staff members doing grunts and squeaks. And I think like once the internet came along and the voice chasers and some of these pages about special voices and all that, that's one of the things that made us think, well, you know, now that we know that there is an interest. But they were all dedicated to the era from when TV cartoons began because people had screen credits. The credits themselves were there to be researched, and then it was just up to the really crazed guys to compile them all into all of these massive lists and things, and then start doing a bit of research. Again, I think that was about 3 or 4 years before the advent of the search engines allowing old newspapers to be investigated. I mean, that's when Don Yelp really came into his own because he was great at that stuff.
Oh yeah, his blog is fantastic. I highly recommend anyone,
especially that Hanna-Barbera one. The early one, the Yelp one, fabulous. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Anyone who has any interest in this sort of stuff should definitely follow his blog. 100%. It's fantastic stuff there. Stuff that I'm still learning. I'm saying, oh wow, it's
usually he still surprises you occasionally with something that like there's a new thing I didn't know, and he was very gracious in just sending me a bunch of stuff while this was all being put together over the years. But I first heard about him because somebody I really respect, Mark Kausler, whose name is in every animation history ever written, I guess.
Yeah.
He was saying, have you seen this new blog? This Yelp guy, and so I looked at it, and it was in the early stages of where he would do one Hanna-Barbera cartoon on each week. He put the blog out, and with all those screen captures and all this detail about the music cues, and I thought, wow, this guy really is doing this very professionally.
Definitely. Now, in the book, of course, not everyone could be identified. I mean,
Yes.
it should go without saying. I guess, one example I can think of off the top of my head is the Bing Crosby impersonation that was in, I think, Let It Be Me, or
Yes.
all that. I mean, what would you say is perhaps your most, I guess, frustrating, so to speak, unidentified voices? And have there been any new clues since to some of these more frustrating ones that you could identify?
I'd say what the one that you mentioned would be one in that 1930s period where the cartoons started to get more interesting by doing caricatures and so on. Simply because we didn't find any of the records for the 1930s at the Warner Brothers archive, and Leith Adams did say, "I have a horrible feeling a whole decade's worth of this paper was just junked to make room for what was saved." There were occasional little things that we'd come across. There was a little piece in a newspaper, one line that said a guy named Billy Paye, Paye, owned up to doing a Bing Crosby for a Warner Brothers cartoon. And I'm thinking he's the one in Let It Be Me and Bingo Crosbyana. It's the same guy, without confirmation. This is where you can present the information the way I did in the narrative part of the book, and then it's up to either me to do further research, or maybe somebody will come back to me and say, "Hey, I found out more about this Billy Paye guy." That's what I'm hoping will happen. And then, of course, the one that is the one that's been bugging me for years is the voice in that Warner Brothers Country Mouse.
Yes, the Country Mouse.
I'm big and tough, and he's also the great Papa Scarecrow in I'd Love to Take Orders, and a few others. So there is one guy who was obviously known by the cartoon makers as a go-to guy for character voices for about 3 years. Who is he? This is one of these mysteries, and it's so frustrating only because so much has come to light that it's like, oh, these last frustrating 5 or 10 people,
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess, if you had a time machine, but you were only able to solve one voice mystery, I mean, what would it be? Would it be that one, or would it be something else?
It'd probably be somebody like that one, only because it would take care of another 10 cartoons that are mysteries, because it's the same guy. Or if another ongoing mystery is the enormous amount of different squeaky women that Walter Lantz used in the early black and white Oswald cartoons. It's almost like every actress in Hollywood probably came in and did a high falsetto squeaky voice. But he would play tricks on the audience. As I point out in the Walter Lantz chapter, some of those early Oswalds are so bizarre that his voice changes from a man to a woman in the same cartoon, and also doing a child and a child boy and a child girl voice, and it's still the same character talking all the way through the cartoon. It's like, is he doing this on purpose, or are they all just falling about laughing in the studio while they're making it,
Wow. Yeah, I actually haven't seen a lot of those, but
Right.
now I need to, based on what I read in the book, for
Right.
sure. Now, we all know, of course, memory is a funny thing. We all misremember names, events, and so on, and that. I
Absolutely.
mean, were any voice acting credits given to you either by interviews or wherever, and then later on you discovered, oh, hang on, actually, so-and-so got it wrrong?
Yes.
Did that ever happen?
The famous one for many, many years was that the great spider voice in Meatless Fly Days was thought by Hames and a friend of his to be this character actor named Cyrus Kendall, because it just sounded like him, and I'd heard a voice like him on radio. But the common knowledge was that Tex Avery had done the voice, because it did have that sort of laugh that he did in some of the ones that he owned up to doing in his own cartoons. I wonder if Tex Avery misremembered this, and then finally when I got to USC, the Warner Brothers archive, it said Cyrus Kendall, the actor. And I can tell there's a difference. There's one line in it that sounds to me as if, because Tex Avery remembered he'd gone to MGM and John Burton called him to come back and do this voice. And he insisted on that in one of the interviews that he did. And he told Mark Evanier that when he was working at Hanna-Barbera at the end of his life. And I have a feeling that what happened was that Johnny Burton got him in to audition for the Spider voice. And Friz Freleng, meanwhile, who told me that he had heard the Cy Kendall character voice on a radio show, probably made the executive decision, yeah, well, Tex has worked for me on a few bits that I've done, but I want Cy Kendall. But Tex remembered doing an audition for it. Unfortunately, unless we find a bit of news report saying that for sure, this is all speculation. That's one of the ones.
Of course.
And then, of course, the famous example is, and it's not just me, is that I knew that the very first baby bear in the Three Bears, Bugs Bunny and the Three Bears, the first iteration of those characters, was Kent Rogers, because by now I knew his voice quality. I really learned it because when Bob Clampett said to Hamesware in a letter, I was the first person to use Kent Rogers as Horton the Elephant. And once we heard that confirmed, that quality where I meant what I said, that quality in his voice, that's the guy who's doing all this other stuff. And so he's the baby bear in this Bugs Bunny Three Bears. Famously, in Volume 2 of the Looney Tunes Golden Collection, Stan Freberg, who was getting on in years by then, did the commentary for that and insisted it was him.
Yeah.
And he was mishearing his own vocal quality. I mean, he did it fairly close, but it was definitely not Stan doing it,
Yeah, I mean, that was rather unfortunate. And when I remember getting to that track, I was looking up going, well, hang on, I'm listening to this commentary, but then I remember you were saying it was Ken, and it's like,
yes,
what is it? But yeah, of course, it's Kent, as you mentioned.
Well, that's one reason I wanted to include just a couple of screenshots in the photographic section of the book, which is definitely low-res photos, but it had a couple of those requisitions to get outside talent, and you'll see Kent Rogers and Mel Blanc listed. Yes, exactly. Yeah,
those ones. Yeah,
on a couple of those forms that I reproduced from USC.
Well, here's a bit Meatless Fly Day, as you've...
yes, yeah, I definitely wanted to put that one in.
Which is right here for people to see.
Yes, that's right. They're things that I had to just reduce them, because if I'd reproduced the exact page, I think there's a copyright thing on each thing at USC, which I'm using the fair use doctrine for this book because it's more of an educational book.
Oh, I know fair use pretty well with my channel.
Well, even with the cover, that's the only place with character images, and I was even loath to do that. I was just going to have the pictures of the actors, but as Ben Omart said, he sent me a screenshot of his revised Mel Blanc book where he had all the Warner's characters on the cover, and he said, this has been out for 10 years and I've never had a legal complaint. So because his books aren't distributed in airports or major bookstores, we're pretty safe doing this and claiming fair use.
Yeah, exactly. And as someone who, as you can imagine, has dealt with a lot of fair use, and with Warner Brothers Legal and all that sort of stuff. I mean, they basically said, with my original commentaries, their only objection was I used the whole thing.
That's right.
Applying it here, you're educating. I mean, this cover to me, I mean, it's a great cover. It's describes exactly what it is without you having to read the title, which makes it a good cover.
Well, I remember you even came up with a similar idea, which I had of the microphone with the voices around it, and so I knew I was in the ballpark when you also had that similar idea. But I mean, even I know exactly what you're going through with the legality side of it, and it's their right, of course, it's intellectual property. But I remember with the Rocky and Bullwinkle book that I wrote, Moose That Roared, that had to be on hold for about 4 years while J. Ward Productions had various court cases going about ownership rights. Once they released those first VHS tapes through Disney of Rocky and Bullwinkle, like there were music rights suddenly came up and they had to make payouts to the original musician, Alex Anderson, who created Crusader Rabbit, suddenly wanted a bit of the action. So they then decided that the book that they had approved, I had to stop writing it right now and wait until all these court cases were solved, which was 4 years. So I was that book itself took 10 years to come to fruition.
Yeah, well, and it's a shame because I know that certain folk would love to make some sort of a like a Warner Brothers book where it's like every page it was like a full color description of every single shore with all the information, like similar to that Simpsons book where they had seasons 1 to 20 and every.
Well, similar to the one Jerry did of the 100 greatest Looney Tunes cartoons.
Yeah, that would be something, and to do something like that, you would have to go for legal.
And yet, it should be out there. There should be a book like that because these are such. They're almost 100 years old now, so I mean, that should be a reason that they're just historical, and they're still popular, even with people who don't get all the topical references. They're simply, I think, the finest series of theatricals ever made.
I totally agree, and then as Jerry Beck himself told me, he says I'm starting with the best, and I agree, and it's just an incredible journey,
and it's also the reason, of course, that I wanted to have Warner Brothers as Chapter One, not only Mel Blanc, but just because they are recognized today as the benchmark of theatrical era cartoons.
Yeah, indeed. Now, you've solved a lot of voice acting mysteries, but what would you say is the one that took you perhaps the longest time, where it might have been resolved just from maybe a fluke from some obscure article in some obscure newspaper?
I'd say it was probably the case of Dave Weber, who did so many voices for Warner's and Lantz and Columbia in the late 30s, because for so many years it was confused because he changed his name from Dave Weber to Danny Webb, and we'd been told by Bob Clampett and a few other people these two names. When the researchers were much younger, myself included, this was just somebody there was no information about this mysterious couple of people who did cartoon voices. They were like phantoms in our mind. And finally, it came out that I found in one of my trips to LA some photos of the two guys in these old Academy Players books. They were like the radio casting books. Haynes Ware was looking at them, and he phoned me up from Arkansas and said, "You know what? Put these photos side by side and check the shape of his ear. I think it's the same guy." And staring us right in the face was the fact that in one of the entries, there was a guy called Lou Weber, who was obviously a relative, who was one of the agency people. And his name was also under Danny Webb, not Weber. And it was like, oh, wait a minute. And then we went and he found an old letter from Clampett that said Danny Webb or Weber. And it was like, all this time he was trying to remember the name himself. Then finally, when I was at Columbia doing the UPA cartoons, I pulled out a sheet, and there was something about the one on camera thing that Danny Webb did as an impressionist, doing the Joe Penner voice and all of that. And it said in the contract, dated like late 38, next year, 1939, this artist will be changing his professional name to Danny Webb. So it was like there was that information, and I took a photocopy of it and all of that, and it was like, there's 2 years worth of sweat, and it was all solvable straight away.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, I would imagine there'll be other voice artists that just are still obscure even today, like John T. Smith. And
yes, that's right. Yeah, still very obscure. Yeah,
yeah.
We're still waiting for an article to appear about him. Yarp is really, diligent about looking for something about John T. Smith, because he did have such an interesting range of voices that people remember, because it was that 50s era of Chuck Jones.
Exactly. It seemed like he just came in and did some cartoons over some period of time and then just disappeared.
He disappears, although Dawes Butler did tell me that he used to do voiceovers on commercials with him in the 50s. But yeah, he seemed to just disappear or die or whatever happened to him. But no, another thing I've been hoping for, but so far hasn't happened, is that word will get out to some family relatives or, of these people and say, hey, you mentioned my uncle or my grandfather in your book, and I have some information on him, So.
I hope so.
He devoutly wished, yeah.
Exactly, because I personally think John T. Smith, I love his
Oh,
his
yeah.
vocal quality, as you mentioned, his range.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. So it'd be nice to know more about him. And there was one, and I wrote the name down, and apologies, it must have deleted when I edited these questions. I
Right.
don't know if it was Bernice Hansel or there was another one that she
Yes.
was due to be interviewed, but then she had moved.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah. It was when Hames got that great phone call with Bob Clampett, which began all of this. And then that same day, when he told her about this woman, Bernice Hansen, he called it Hansen. Clampett's usually infallible memory just failed him, and Hansen's such a common surname, you know.
Yeah.
So he looked up that, and also Hansel, because Graham Webb, the guy in England, had seen something when he was in the Disney archive, sent him, which looked like Hansel. It was in handwriting, but so he looked up both names in the LA phone book and found Bernice Hansen, who he thought was the one because it's in the Hollywood area. And he phoned the number and said, "Oh, she just moved out last week, and there's new tenants here now." So it was like, again, one of those kick yourself moments. It's like, oh, if only I'd been here a week earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because when I read
because
that book,
she did live until 1980, so there could have been some information. It would have been great to talk to her about those very early Tex Avery at Warner Brothers cartoons, where she was Kitty in the Beans, Porky Pig era.
yeah,
Right.
that would have been absolutely fascinating. And also, even in certain cases, to just get a female perspective of voice
Yeah.
acting too.
Yeah, exactly. I would love to know if there was, any sexism, I suppose, from those days, which I'm sure there was, but, or whether it was, all the years I did voiceovers, which was like 40 years starting in 72, there was never any problem with the female side of it, because the union that we belonged to, which used to be called Actors Equity, had already come up with fees for different voiceover jobs, and they were identical, male and female. So I spent 40 years in an industry where there always was equal pay for either sex, either gender. The only people who got bigger money were like a famous radio talent like John Laws, who did voiceovers. Because he was such a famous name, he then charged his own special fee, Otherwise, it was a set union fee. And very interestingly, women and men got equal pay in that field, whether it was a character voice or whatever it was.
Which, as it should be, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah, but apparently, as I found out in years to come, most unusual, because in most other endeavors, the men were the ones who were the winners.
Exactly, and it would be interesting to see some sort of a book or something of a female voice actor from that period of time, similar to what Martha Siegel did when she did her book about being a Inca painter at Warner Brothers at the time.
Yes, she was even a great help. She clarified a couple of things, and but it would have been a great thing. June Foray's book was more, by the time she was pretty advanced in years, by the time her book came out, and it was pretty much just the standard biography. It didn't go into those issues you talked about. She remembered all her life that her first cartoon job was for Disney. After she did a couple of their Capitol records, she did Cinderella in 1950 when that was released. But already I'd found an old article in one of the Radio Life magazines from the mid-40s which said she'd done a Sniffles and a Oswald the Rabbit. And this is in the mid-40s, and she couldn't remember. She had literally no memory of it when I asked her. And I said, well, this is dated like 1945 or whatever. And she goes, I wish I could. And then when I got to USC, sure enough, there was the note from Unbearable Bear, June Foray, and this other girl, Marge Tarleton, who did Sniffles, on that same sheet. And we heard her voice in the one revival of Oswald Rabbit was Egg Cracker Suite for Walter Lantz. And Walter Lantz had told some interviewer that he got June Foray in for that, but then discovered that she couldn't sing. So they had to get a different woman to do the singing part in that. And the little things like that are all just tiny little anecdotes and things that finally got put together. It was like, wow, there really is a book in this, because it just seemed like tons of little tiny bits and pieces,
Now, what would you say is, I don't know if this has overlapped some of the previous questions, and I do apologize, but
That's all right. Yeah.
perhaps the most surprising discovery. So perhaps something that was set in stone, so to speak, as, yep, this is true, but then all of a sudden, no, it's not. But I guess the most surprising discovery, 'cause this was one of my friends is asking that particular question.
Right. Yeah. No, I think in the early days it was the hunter in Along Came Daffy, not Along Came Daffy, the other one where it's done by Victor Moore. Ain't That Ducky? One of those ones.
One of the ones with the really generic frizz-freeling
Yes.
titles that were just
Yes, that's
annoying
right.
me to no
But
end.
it was the hunter that was this famous old vaudevillian comedy actor Victor Moore, and it was a caricature of him, and it was like, why is this suddenly replacing Elmer Fudd? And then Elmer Fudd was back again, and it was a once off. And so many people in the early days had guessed that was Bill Thompson doing the voice because it had that same husky quality. And I knew it wasn't. But finally, it was like, I think Jerry Beck he said he couldn't believe his luck. He said he got Frizz Freeling in a restaurant for that interview in Anamata. He said, I got him on a great day. He wasn't grumpy and he was really talkative. And he was the one who came up with that story about how Earl Duval got fired. And all of this came out of that one interview Jerry Beck got from a really happy Frizz Freeling day. And that's he also mentioned Victor Moore in that cartoon. And he said, he was on the Warner Brothers lot doing a movie. And he said, I'd love to be in a cartoon, and all I ask is you give me a drawing.
Wow.
So he ended up doing that crazy hunter that just was like a once off. It was like such a mystery. Why did Warner Brothers do this? And then it all just makes sense. He happened to be on the lot and came in and said, I love your cartoons. Often you think there's some great reasoning behind something, and it turns out to be something mundane that just makes perfect sense years later,
Oh, exactly. I remember watching that cartoon as a kid, and I was wondering, why didn't they use Elmer Fudd?
Arthur Q. Bryan, yeah.
Exactly. And now we
Well,
know,
I
of
did
course.
find out also, I think there was one period where in the getting to the late 40s where Elmer was only in like one cartoon in 18 months, and that was because he had gone to New York for one season of the Milton Berle radio show. So he was living in New York for a year.
Now, another question one of my friends has wanted me to ask, which I think is a good one, is that, which studio do you think had the most interesting history when it comes to voice acting? Now, I know you mentioned Warner Brothers, of course, that's why you put in the forefront with Mel Blanc and so on.
Right.
But which would you say Warner Brothers would be it, or do you think the other studios have more interesting history?
In one sense, but in another sense, I'd say just for sheer volume of the amount of people that were hired would be Disney, because not only his features, but his shorts, even beginning around about 35, used almost every radio actor in town at least once doing a funny voice or a character, and didn't want to rely on a specialty like Mel Blanc. That was Walt Disney's own way of thinking. He was he and Mel Blanc got on in real life. Apparently, they shared some interests, and also he was on the weekly Mickey Mouse radio show. Mel Blanc was, but Disney did not want to use him in the shorts. I think he probably had used Billy Bletcher so often as a regular that he didn't want to suddenly hire Mel Blanc, who was becoming known as the man of 1,000 voices by then, because Disney thought that was Warner Brothers' way. I've got my own way of making cartoons.
And I've also thought that the Walter Lantz chapter was very very interesting.
He loved trying new people, or at least Seamus Culhane, his director, did. Some of those voices in the mid-40s at Lantz for the swing symphonies and all of them are great character voices.
And also, and Tex Avery, again, it's all in the book for, and just he seemed to always try these different radio actors. Like he didn't, when he was at MGM, he did not seem to have a consistent thing. Of course, Bill Thompson, Droopy, but aside from that, it seemed to be a bit of
he I don't think he was as interested in making another Bugs Bunny famous character as Fred Quimby was wanting him to, because, as I say, his whole modus operandi was gags, and he was just constantly obsessed with making the next one funnier than the one preceding that. But he still, and some people used to think there was a real inconsistency to some of the voices he used and all that. But turns out that every decision he made was very, very thought through, and he auditioned people relentlessly, and then often ended up doing a better voice himself. I think I pointed all that out.
Yeah.
He really had a gift for comedy acting as a director, whereas a lot of them who tried it were a sort of so-so.
Especially his laugh. His
Yes.
laugh
Oh,
is
that was which you can hear as early as things like Amateur Night. The hippo in the audience.
Yeah,
Right.
but the biggest surprise with Tex Avery for me, and you pointed this out way back when I did My Little Buckaroo, which I
Oh yeah, yeah.
which I sadly had the mistaken information. Which again, that's why this is so great. We have these books, but it was actually Tex Avery doing that off key
Yes, the singing.
singing.
Yeah, of the title song, the Andy Devine voice. Yeah.
Now, who wouldn't want to be a fly on the wall for that recording session?
Yeah.
I think that would be one
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
one of the best ones. Now, lastly, one of my another of my friends have wanted to put this to you. Now, of course, these days it's relatively easy for people. Well, I say relatively easy for people to do voice acting from their own home.
Sure. Oh yeah.
I mean, look
Yeah.
at what we're doing here with using Zencaster and so
Right.
on to make it sound professional. And of course, during pandemic, you've had recent films like Raya and the Last Dragon and a few other Pixar films where they actually record people. They would be in their closets and
That's right.
and
Yeah.
do that sort of stuff. I can think of two examples where the voice artists couldn't record in the studio. Of course, Mel Blanc after his automobile
Yes.
accident, and
That's right.
I believe also McKimson Jr. mentioned the soundtrack for The Mouse That Jack Built.
Right.
One of the actors, she refused to go to the studio, so they had to go to Jack Benny's house.
That's right. Mary Livingston, his wife, because she was pretty much retired from. Well, she always considered herself a non-professional, but her Mary character on the Jack Benny radio show was really popular because she was just sarcastic back to her husband in a comedy sense, and she had an ability at it, which she downplayed. She was always nervous about being in front of an audience. So by that age, in the late 50s, with his radio show long stopped, I think that made sense that they had to go and record her where she was comfortable. But I can't really think of any other situations like that except for the occasional one where they couldn't book the main recording booth at Warner Brothers Burbank studio, so they would just do the few little dialogue lines if it was a pre-record in a very soundproofed soundstage area where they were doing a feature film, and it was after hours, and they'd bring in the guy with the boom mic and the little console and just record an actor like that. Stan Freberg said he remembered quite a few sessions which were in that situation. But really, I can't think of any major things apart from the one where Mel Blanc was so horribly broken up in that auto accident. There is some truth in that story because we used to also think that story about saying "Yeah, what's up, doc?" to the brain surgeon was again one of those publicity stories. But it has since come out that something like that, maybe not exactly that funny story, but something like that happened while he was in the hospital. I think it was more probably that as he was recovering, he did the voice, and the doctor was just amazed. Boy, this guy's so he's what he's been through. But they turned it into that story. But his doctor, I think his name's Louis Cowan, was interviewed on a podcast with Noel Blanc talking about that accident.
I think it's also a testament to just how great Mel Blanc was. Like, he's all injured, he's in bed,
right,
and in recovery, and yet he was still able to do his.
That's why I do believe, like when he was first coming back, the Barney Rubble voice changed slightly in the earliest episodes before he had the accident. It was like this character, Fred. Kind of a dumb guy, Fred. Gee, and then later on, after he was weakened, he was that kind of soft Barney Rubble voice, which I think didn't take much energy. and that as he got stronger, you could hear you know, and like the strength of it increased. So, but a fascinating chapter that he was so in demand that they came to his house and recorded him. And there are those photos of Alan Reed and B. Benaderet leaning over his bed while he's got a mic suspended above his head.
Yeah, and I remember as a kid, when I was watching a lot of the Flintstones, because it actually remains my favorite animated TV show.
Cartoon.
Well,
I love it.
Despite my shirt being Simpsons, of course,
well, I was just watching the Blu-ray set the other night, the complete Blu-ray set of the Flintstones.
Yeah, I got it on my shelf to my to my left there, and it's a great set. It's just a shame that they didn't put The Man Called Flintstone in high definition. I don't know why.
I know.
Why put that wrestling film on? Like, I don't know.
I know, the SmackDown, yeah.
It's a bit of a shame, but the restoration I thought was pretty nice.
The
early seasons.
The TV cartoons look great, yeah.
I mean, the later seasons, the restoration, little iffy, I thought. I don't know if they cut, but...
And also, I know they said that in the later seasons they've got correct credits at the end, but even there's a couple that are wrong, voice-wise.
Yeah, that's what I would like to, if I actually had time, which I don't have, actually go in there and Frankenstein the different
yes. Well, I was hoping maybe there was a Flintstone site with some Flintstones obsessive who's already made a list of those mistakes, but I may find that on the internet.
And I will definitely want to kind of paste it because because it goes back to the fact that originally no voice credit whatsoever, and now we've got a different problem, which is of course if there are credits, it's
misplaced credits,
misplaced. So it's like
they got it right when they put they remastered the Jetsons on Blu-ray. They finally found the exact credits that matched each episode, so it can be done.
Exactly. I don't know, George from Warner Archive. Right. I always, again, I'm sometimes terrible with surnames.
Feltenstein.
Feltenstein, yes, there we are. Sorry, I'm kind of like Mo when he tries to pronounce Worcestershire sauce. I'm sort of like really, I can be all over the place with that. But no, I heard that he wanted to do the Flintstones as well, but for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. But
yeah,
still, errors aside, it's still a pretty solid set, I thought. It just doesn't have the audio commentaries that were in the original DVDs, which I still have, but.
I just wish they'd got to Alan Reed in time, to do a latter day retrospective, or B. Benaderet, all these people who just made it to the end of the series, and B. Benaderet couldn't because she got ill and she was doing Petticoat Junction. But Alan Reed would have been such a great person to do if he hadn't been old and infirm, a great retro interview about the Flintstones years,
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of, like even before your book came out, I was starting to notice a few voice actors, and I noticed, Alan Reed. I was watching some of the Goofies.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was like, hang on, I know this voice. It's not, And then I realized it sounds kind of like Fred, but it's not Fred. Yeah. It's when Fred is
Fred puts on an affected voice. Yeah,
like when he's like more polite, like when he's got an alternate personality or something.
Oh yes, of course, Mr. Bernard.
Yeah, with the whole pick your finger up, all that kind of.
That's right.
Certainly, Bernard. That kind of. Sorry, I don't have the volume of my voice, but. But in hearing that, and then I'm hearing the Goofy, I'm like, is that Alan Reed? Then I'll look it up, and indeed, it is. And there was one he did where Goofy has a 2-week holiday.
That's right, 2 weeks vacation, yeah.
And I didn't realize that not only did he do the narration, but he also played the bum.
Yes, there's one, and also in another one, I think you can hear his voice on the radio as one of the cops.
Pull over to the side, or stuff like that,
and occasionally, if he does a heavy voice like that, it does sound very much like Fred.
Move it to the side there,
exactly.
But then there's also another one where you can hear Jim Backus in one of the Disney shorts, and these people. So they were also just finding, that there was more opportunities in the 50s as TV was suddenly encroaching, and then, of course, who knew that there was going to be this whole new era of TV voiceover work, which was, as I point out at the end of my book, even more work for the actors because there was much more dialogue in the TVs than they'd ever had in the old theatricals.
Indeed. And I like how at the end you point out that voice acting these days is, of course, way different in a lot of ways,
Huge.
but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
in
Oh,
that.
yes, of course. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And
Yes. Yeah. A lot of the basics haven't changed over the years. Yeah.
indeed, and now it's I guess less radio, of course, but now
Right.
more,
Yeah.
of course, what we're doing, podcasts and video games. Of course, that's huge.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Gaming industry, and also the Audible books.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like recently, I listened to a 31-hour audiobook on Buster Keaton, which was
Oh, yeah. Right.
amazing. Because
Right.
again, the book was great. I started reading it, but I found the audiobook to be more.
Right. Yeah.
So when are you gonna do the audiobook?
Yeah, I've had a few people ask.
It could be interesting, but
Yeah.
but I won't press you on that. But I reckon that would be an interesting thing. I mean, perhaps not for volume 2 though. So,
No, it'd be more just the narrative. Yeah, the story itself. Yeah.
For sure. Maybe listen to some of that in the car. But no, that's great. Look, I'm so glad to have you on with these books. I mean, I'm going to have links below to both books, which I'll hold up once again.
Oh, thank you so much. And for anyone who hasn't got it and wants it, the usual suspects: Amazon,
At
Barnes
Bear
and Noble, or at Bear Manor Media itself.
Yeah, hardcover and softcover versions too.
Yes, there are. Yeah.
I just prefer the soft cover and that, of course, but a lot of people prefer the hardcover. But at least you got a choice, which I think is fantastic.
Yep. There's that, and there's also, I think, there is now a Kindle version which won't have the photographic section. The photographic section, as I say at the beginning, is low res. Some people were so rare that there were no modern age high res photos of these people.
Exactly, like we probably like a photo of that, and I have the same.
Well,
problem.
that was a rare find at the Motion Picture Academy. I found that picture of him who was the last voice of Buddy. Yeah, and he was one of the voices of Al Jolson in I Left a Singer.
Wow, it's just incredible, just all these different actors and that. And,
yeah.
But in terms of low res, I have that same problem too, where I want to show something interesting in one of my reviews,
Right.
but the only thing I could find is some real low resolution thing, and then on someone's TV, if they're watching the review, it's just this pixelated mess. But that's all I can do. Sorry, folks. I'm mindful of resolution, but
exactly.
I can only do so much.
But we do what we can with what we've got. It's such an arcane topic that goes back to the portal into the early 30s is still seems so long ago to me, and like a bit of a mystery because we don't have that much information. Indeed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But Keith, I'm so glad to have you on here. I hope to also have you on another review at some point soon.
Yeah.
1951 is being recorded like after this.
Yes, that's right.
So a lot of classics there. Maybe I'll get you if you want to join me on a Hunter trilogy, and I don't know. We'll see what we can do, time permitting, of course. But yeah, thanks for joining.
My pleasure, Anthony, and thank you for a great chat about the book. I do appreciate the plug, and for those people of your wide audience who home in on the cartoon side of things, it's probably not me just trying to plug it, but saying it is a book you probably need for your library if you're into history of cartoons.
Indeed, alongside the various others like what Jerry Beck and Michael Barrier and Leonard Maltin and so on have written, it definitely belongs in there. But as always, guys, thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.
Bye-bye.